Your reaction to what you heard from Ben Bernanke just now?
I agree with much of what you said. It was a pro-growth type of statement and a suggestion with some additional definition in terms of when the tapering might begin and when it might end. You know, obviously, according to a 7% unemployment number, you know, that speaks in his mind and perhaps in my mind to early 2014. But I might also say, in terms of questions and answers, and that's critical, I think, that he did speak to the conditional influence of inflation, that even if unemployment came down to 7%, if inflation did not go up, you know, to 2% or close to 2%, then, you know, they'd look around and, you know, perhaps readjust their decisions. So this is a combined growth, unemployment, and inflation type of combination that has to be delicately managed. And I think the market basically has misinterpreted the growth and then the unemployment targets while leaving out the inflation targets going forward.
So what do you mean by misinterpreted? I mean, we're seeing a sell-off right here. We're seeing yield spike on the 10-year. What is it that the market's missing, Bill?
Well, I think they're missing the influence on inflation that, you know, obviously the chairman has considered, and perhaps the committee as well. I mean, there was a question in Q&A that basically said, Mr. Chairman, you know, if we're down at 1% inflation and it doesn't rise, then real interest rates basically are in a quandary to which you have limited flexibility. And he said, I agree completely with you know, the premise of your question. And so I would think that markets are looking at this 7% unemployment rate and suggesting that the tapering will end at that point. I would suggest that yes, you know, he did say 7% in terms of an unemployment target at which tapering would end, presumably early in 2014, but he also qualified significantly a number of times, you know, inflation has to go back up towards that 2% target, and at the moment we're not there. So those that are selling treasuries, you know, in anticipation that the Fed will ease out of the market, I think might be disappointed unless we have inflation close to 2%.
And Bill, your interpretation, how do you think Chairman Bernanke and the Fed would respond if in fact we don't get that 2% level? Specifically, what do you think they might do?
You know, I think the chairman is almost deathly afraid, and we've witnessed this in speeches going back 5 or 10 years on the part of the chairman in terms of, you know, the helicopter speech and the reference not only to the Depression but to the lost decades in Japan. I think he's deathly afraid of deflation, and so as we, you know, meander back and forth around the 1% level, you know, I would suggest that the chairman, you know, to the extent that he has perhaps a limited time left in terms of being the chairman, that he would, you know, guide the committee, you know, towards not only an unemployment rate, which obviously has been emphasized in terms of the Q&A, but also, you know, towards a higher inflation target, which is really a target. It's not something in terms of a cap, but the inflation target of 2%, and, you know, for the next year or two, 2.5% has been specifically, you know, delineated in terms of that. It's a target, and so, you know, those that think it's a cap and that we're 1% below the cap and therefore, you know, the Fed doesn't care about it, you know, I think the chairman told us the Fed does care about it, the chairman does care about it, and so the closer we get to 2%, the better as far as he's concerned.
So that's a new metric for everybody to be watching very carefully alongside Ben Bernanke. You did mention, Bill, that he has a limited time left. He was asked about that. He declined to comment on that. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on Janet Yellen as she's the one that's most expected, anticipated to take his place?
Well, I think she's a Siamese twin in terms of policy. She's very much of a dove. You know, she has chaired the communication effort on the part of the Fed for the last few years, which has been emphasized and will continue to be emphasized. So, you know, PIMCO doesn't want to be in a position of endorsing anyone. We would simply endorse a chairman or a chairwoman, a chairperson, you know, that, you know, perhaps would emphasize Main Street as well as Wall Street, which has been the emphasis certainly for the past 3 to 4 years.
Hi, Bill, it's Mike McKee. If we could maybe put together your views and Chairman Bernanke's views, when do you see the Fed, based on your forecasts, starting to taper QE, and when do you need to start trading on that?
You know, based upon what he said, based upon what the Fed estimates have given us, in the last hour, it suggests, yes, that towards the end of the year, as we hit 7.25%, or if we hit 7.25%, and again, importantly, if inflation rises as opposed to stays at 1%, that the Fed would begin to taper, and that ultimately they would end tapering in perhaps the first quarter of 2014. Is that a realistic possibility? At PIMCO, we don't think that really is. We think that the chairman and the Fed is taking very much of a cyclical type of view. I mean, he blames lower growth basically on fiscal austerity and expects towards the end of the year, once that's gone, that all of a sudden the economy will be growing at 3%. He blames housing prices moving up on homeowners that simply like higher home prices, as opposed to emphasizing the mortgage rate, which is really what has provided the lift in the first place. So to a certain extent, his driving analogy, in which he talked about pulling back on the accelerator, I think he may be driving in a fog. I think the Fed itself may be driving in a fog to think that it's a cyclical as opposed to a structural problem in terms of our economy. I simply think, and I think PIMCO simply thinks, that real growth, to lower unemployment below 7% is a long shot over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months.
Bernanke may be driving in a fog. Wow, that's quite a statement there from you. Structural issues that just can't necessarily be addressed through Fed policy right now?
Well, several, Trish. Certainly globalization in terms of dampening wages. That's been with us for a long time, but it's not going away. Demographics in terms of the aging of our society and the boomers, et cetera. Which produces a lowered level of demand, and the race against the machine, in which technology is basically eliminating jobs as opposed to providing them. So he makes no mention of these, and these, to our way of thinking, are significant in terms of keeping unemployment higher than what he suggests is a 5 to 6% new NAIRU type of range. To the extent that we can get the 5 to 6% in the headwinds of these structural elements that I just suggest, it's a tall order.